In this lesson, you will learn how to prepare a list of contacts and relate them to the accounts you loaded in the previous lesson. Before you can insert your new contact records, there are a handful of preload steps to follow. The first of which is to make sure your user workbook is nearby, as you may want to reference user IDs when preparing your contact map. You will also want to have your account workbook nearby, as you may want to reference the account IDs created during the account insert. If every contact in your file has a related account, and each of those accounts has a legacy account ID that you loaded in the previous insert, then you can configure the data loader to map to this legacy ID during the contact load. Otherwise, you'll need to make sure that you have a list of related accounts with the Salesforce ID and use Excel's VLOOKUP function to pull in each contact's related account ID. If you don't relate a contact to an account, the contact is considered private, which means it's not searchable or reportable, even as a system admin. If any of your contacts don't have a related account in the dataset, create an account called OrphanContacts and use it to fill in any account ID blanks in your file. As always, make sure you've created your legacy ID field on the contact object and that you've implemented your validation and automation bypass logic, or temporarily deactivated everything that can cause your load to fail. Since adding bypass logic on duplicate rules can be finicky, I recommend going into Setup and temporarily deactivating them. This is pretty easy to do. Head over to Setup, use the quick find to search for duplicate rules, and deactivate any applicable rules before you load. Now that we're ready to create our contact map, we want to make sure that we're using the API field names in our mapping. As always, I have included these in the contact workbook attached to the lesson. Regarding data prep, Salesforce requires every contact to have a last name. Check your file to ensure every contact record has a value in the last name field, and where there are blank values, replace them with a placeholder value such as unknown. Similar to accounts, Salesforce will accept pretty dirty data with the exception of invalid email addresses. Any emails that are incorrectly formatted will error out. So if this happens, you'll have to either format them correctly for the subsequent load or ignore them altogether. One more fun fact about inserting contacts is that the email opt-out field is hidden from all profiles by default. If you attempt to map to it in the data loader, you won't see it until you adjust the field level security settings and provide the necessary access to your and other profiles. I've logged into Salesforce and I'm getting ready to import some new contact records. Before I do that, I needed to create a new account record, and I called it Orphaned Contacts because when I did my data analysis, I did find some contacts that did not have an account record that was loaded into Salesforce. So I'm going to associate those contacts to this account, which I can grab the ID from the address bar and place it into my workbook. I'm also heading back to the setup area, and I'm going to double check that my contact record types are active and that I have the appropriate labels for them. And if I needed to double check any of my field API names, I can do that in the Object Manager under Contact and then go to my Fields and Relationships tab. Let's take a look at our contact workbook. On the first tab, called Sample Contacts, this is the raw data that we received from our client. We copied this information and placed it into a new tab called Contacts Mapped. This is where we can transform the data so that Salesforce will accept it. Using this type information, we transformed this field into the record type assignment. The X in front of the type value here means we did not want to delete the data from our source file, but we also don't want to map it. In columns B and C, I've provided the header for both mapping to the record type name and the record type ID, but Data Loader will not accept both. So we are going to choose only one when we migrate the data in. And in the real world, when you're doing your data prep, you don't need to take the step of adding in the ID. You can just choose name if that is the direction that you're going to go. Column D is the account name that was included in the source file. Since we map using IDs, we placed an X in front of this because, again, we don't want to delete the source information, but we also don't need to map it. Regarding the account ID, I placed a handful of these contact records in red because you can see that this account ID is the Orphaned Contacts account that we created so that any contacts that didn't have a related account from the source file are going to be placed under that Orphaned Contacts account. Scrolling over to our owner and our created by users, we can either map to the legacy ID on the user object to set the owner and the created by, or we can use Excel's VLOOKUP function to bring in the associated user ID. But again, you can choose only one when you're moving this data into Salesforce. Scrolling over to column M, we have last name, because Salesforce will reject any record that does not have a last name populated. I have replaced any of those blank values with the value of unknown. So you can see here that we have 2 contact records that did not have a last name in the file, and they now have a last name of unknown, so they will not error out. Scrolling over to column T, the next item we need to prepare for is making sure that the birth date has the right formatting. So we'll select this column, go to our date formats, and make sure we select the month, day, and 4-digit year, and apply that. And for our created date, we also need to make sure that this is formatted correctly as it's a date time. So you can navigate to the Excel formatting tab of the workbook, select the date time format, and when you copy it, I recommend clicking the X so Excel doesn't think we're trying to do a calculation. We'll head back to our date time field, head to our number formats and choose custom, and you're going to overwrite any value here with the value you pasted in. Hit OK. And now we have confidence that we have the right date time formatting for the created date stamp. We'll save our work here, copy all of this information, and then we are going to paste it into a CSV file so that we can load it into Salesforce. Notice here that I did delete the original headers because we don't need those in our file. Let's open up the data loader and we will insert to the contact object. We will choose our prepped CSV file. On this screen is where we can choose how we want to map using legacy IDs. And in our prepped file, we took the time to bring in the account ID, so we're not going to use the legacy ID. We are going to map to the record type ID as well as the owner ID and the created by ID. So in this load, we are not going to be setting any of these values in step 2B. Here we will create our map and auto match our fields. And then our best practice is to do a quick scroll down and make sure that everything we expected to map is mapped appropriately. We'll click OK, and then we have to make sure that we are pulling our success and error files into a properly named folder so we can easily find it. We'll finish and proceed. And here we have 100 successful inserts and 0 errors. If we pull over our folder, we'll rename our success file to contact success. We will double click to open it, copy the data, and head back over to our workbook where we'll paste it in, rename this to successes, and then let's grab one of our first success records and head back into Salesforce and let's paste that in after force.com/ so we can navigate directly to one of our newly created contact records. And this is where we would go and double check that the details on the contact record align with what we mapped in and that we didn't miss any of our fields. You can also see that this one happens to be one of our orphaned contacts. So if we're in the account called Orphaned Contacts and we go to related, we can see those 5 contact records that we associated to this are now reportable, and we can reassign them to other accounts if we choose to. Now it's your turn. You're going to log into Salesforce, into your developer org, and navigate to the contact object where you'll create the business contact and partner contact record types. You'll create your legacy ID text field on the contact, and if necessary, you can open up that email opt-out field on field level security. Then you'll open up the contact workbook and copy the sample contacts and add them to a new tab in the workbook. where you can then practice creating your own map and reference the mapped contacts that I placed in that workbook for you to check your work. When you're finished, create a CSV with your data, log into Data Loader, and insert it into your dev org. Remember to rename the Data Loader success file so that it's meaningful. Add your success file to the contact workbook, and always, always, always go back into Salesforce and check your work. Up next, we will load person accounts.